Is Hafish coming?
Yes, he's in the gap. He's in the gap.
Okay.
Excellent. Welcome, everyone. It is so wonderful to see you all here at Climate Law and Governance Day. Bienvenidos todos y todas que están esperando en línea. Merci et bienvenue aussi à cette session. I'm not going to give long, detailed summary remarks today. I'm simply going to say that you are here at the birth of something quite fascinating and very exciting. When we first contacted as 3 editors, the Routledge, and asked them if they had a leading book, a textbook on climate law and governance, they got back to us astonishingly fast, especially for an academic publisher. And they said, not only would you like you to edit this book, but we would like to make it the book, the research handbook of Routledge on climate law and governance. Not just because of these incredible papers that you have, which are collected, by the way, from this forum since Paris. It's you who have generated the chapters that are making this into a world-leading book, but also because they wanted to be able to extend the dialogue far beyond the halls of the COP26, all over the world, where people who are teaching law and governance, all of the different countries that are affected by climate change, would be able to have a new textbook. So they told us this is going to be the Routledge handbook. And so we reached out all across the world to all of our colleagues who have been part of the days over the year. And we reached out to everybody coming here to be part of the days today. We'll probably be reaching out in the future again because they actually gave us the choice. This is how we know they really care, that this particular book, which we had proposed for 28 chapters, could actually have up to 37. Just saying. We will be contacting you. So without further ado, I'm extremely happy to open up this dialogue. We want it to be as participatory as possible. We want the authors of the chapters to have a chance to talk a little bit about what they're doing here in the room, also up on the panel. And then we also would like to be able to, as much as possible, get some ideas from you about what other chapters are missing or should be thought about as we move forward in putting together the new Routledge handbook on climate law and governance. My co-editors are here with me. I'm incredibly glad to see them, especially the one who was trying to save the compliance mechanism for the last couple of weeks. And I'd like to ask them to say a few words.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you so much, Marie-Claire. Thank you for your words and your leadership as usual, but also for your inspiration. And I remember when you approached me or asked me at the same time with the book idea, I was most taken by its title, Courage, Contributions and Compliance. And it wasn't just because there was compliance in it, but because there is a red thread between courage, contributions, and compliance, because it does need courage and political will to come up with contributions that matter. And we just see, maybe we are slowly getting there. But once you've made contributions, like nationally determined contributions, you better also implement and achieve them. And this is, of course, where the compliance aspect comes in, not so much under the Paris Agreement, but much more under domestic law. And this opens up for such a huge array of different topics and invitations to scholars to look at different aspects of the Paris Agreement. And I think so far we've done quite well in who we got on board, but as you said, there's still some missing bits and pieces because it is really a large spectrum of different topics, legal and governance topics, which we are more than happy to explore in this book. Thanks.
Absolutely. No, and I think the title reflects as much, thank you, I always need that, as much of what we all want to see in it. And for me, the idea of courage was the idea of what we tell our students, what we tell emerging scholars in the field and those who want to conduct activities in the field in terms of how you have to apply this type of law, how you have to conceive of this type of law, and how you have to act as lawyers in order to be able to step It would be me. I would break the microphone in order to step up and actually do something that is both meaningful for you as a career choice, but also meaningful as a planetary choice. So that would be my contribution, and I'm staying away from that now.
I'm just as likely to make it do strange things. So we are joined today by a very dear colleague who is here with us online. She is a leader in our field and serves as the Director of Research of the International Development Law Organization in Rome and in The Hague and all over the world. Someone I have worked with very closely for a number of years, and indeed, I think still has some of the most world-leading work on rule of law and climate change. I am very, very honored and pleased that Ilaria Bottigliero is able to join us today and say a few words to open this session before we turn it into a roundtable dialogue with everyone present, especially the authors.
Oh, thank you so much, Marie-Claire. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm really sorry I'm not in Glasgow. I'm following it really closely, but I have to be in Rome. So I would love to be there at that table with you and together with all the other activists to support the cause of rule of law and good governance for climate justice. Congratulations to all of you, to those who have prepared the essays, have read them. They are truly impressive, inspiring, and they will, as you mentioned, lead the way for thinking, not only academic thinking, but also for implementation, practical implementation of these ideas in country situations to concretely improve the situation of so many affected by climate change in the field. And it's from this perspective that I perhaps come in with a few words of encouragement. I was also impressed by the title, the word courage within the title. I think it's an inspiration for all of us. And for me personally, working in an international organization that works on rule of law and justice issue, that word courage is very important because it pushes us to recognize that issues of justice are actually very much linked to the causes of climate change. And it also pushes us to reflect on the fact that if we want to find solutions for climate change and solutions that work, we must approach them also from the justice perspective. So rule of law, governance issues, justice issues cannot be peripheral. They have to be at the center of the search for solution to tackle climate justice. And it is in this vein that, and starting from this point of view, that my organization, IDLO, has developed this new strategy on climate justice, working on several pillars that I see already represented in the various essays that colleagues have developed. For example, linking human rights and development to tackle pre-existing vulnerabilities and inequalities, because we know very well that these contribute and exacerbate climate change. So we cannot be blind to the fact that climate change targets certain people more than others. So part of the solution will be to tackle problems from a priority point of view. So prioritizing solutions to make sure that those most affected are reached earlier. We are also looking at prioritizing and ensuring that fair and inclusive climate decision-making is there. We know again that people and groups that are traditionally excluded from policy process, lawmaking processes are in fact among the most affected. So I was very pleased to see that many of these essays prioritize inclusive decision-making and solutions for those who are most affected, but at the same time most excluded from decision-making processes. And starting from COP to the many other policy venues that will follow, we need to make sure that everyone's voice is heard, but prioritizing is also a task for us. So including those who are most affected is a priority for us at IDLO, and we're taking it very seriously. Finally, I wanted to share a final thought on the need to investing in people-centered laws and institutions. We can't just have institutions and laws that are blind to the needs of people, and that look at people without filters, let's say. We need to make sure that costs and benefits of climate mitigation and adaptations are equitably distributed. And for that, you need laws, regulations, policies that are ad hoc and targeting these specific outputs. So these are just few thoughts, few words, but mostly to encourage all participants and those who have worked so hard on those essays for publication, that IDLO is on your side, that we are here to support your work and to push issues of climate justice from the perspective of those most vulnerable and most affected by climate change. So congratulating you, Marie-Claire, and the organizers again, and very, very good luck and best wishes from Rome, and wishing I was there with you in Glasgow. Thank you, Marie-Claire.
I think sure, Ilaria is not just saying that because it is actually sunny here today, which is quite extraordinary, and we are appreciating it greatly. Of course, we were told that usually 11 months of the year it's beautiful and sunny, so we really should be just no need to appreciate it greatly. It's normal here. But I wish we could see you here in Glasgow as well, Ilaria. We are in a room full of beautiful wood paneling and red draperies and velvet cushions. And it really does feel like being in a different century, and yet at the same time tackling issues that are so important, that the seeds of the destruction we now face were laid in those centuries. So I'm going to move straight to our conversation, our roundtable of this particular set of authors that we are together moving forward with. And in particular, I understand that Barbara is unable to join us today.
Yes.
Yeah. So we would like to, in that case, welcome from St. Thomas University, Professor Cosmin Corendea, who has been with us right from the beginning with this book, and indeed with Climate Law and Governance Day itself, including, of course, when he was working in the United Nations University and helped us to found the day. And I should at that moment also highlight that IDLO was there right at the beginning as well, and has been with us throughout, and it's deeply appreciated. These are the partners that help to carry an initiative like this through the years. So I will ask Cosmin to just briefly give us a few words about his ideas for his chapter. Professor Robert Kibugi is attending a COVID funeral, so he's unable to join us as well from Kenya. He, however, has sent his best regards, and he will do a very good job on his chapter. This is what he says. So I think that's a fairly understandable reason for being unable to be with us today, and we will look forward to being with him in the future instead. But we do have Advocate Magdalena Strajda, who is here representing a chapter that she's co-authoring with Agnieszka and other colleagues from Poland who are here as well. And I think we will also ask them for just a few words about the chapter that they're putting together. And then we have a new author who is joining us as well, because she accidentally gave a brilliant presentation in the pre-conference to this one, the academic conference that was held entirely online, hosted by Cambridge together with Strathclyde and Glasgow. And I think Dr. Megan Bowman, is she in the room? And I'm there you are. Lucky
I'm
me.
off camera. You'll have to, there's my hand.
No, we're just going to trade seats with you.
No, really?
Yeah, I know everybody loves that little balcony and they get to hang over and throw flowers to the multitudes, but no, we're trading seats with you when it comes time. And Megan, by the way, you were brilliant, but I saw you only online.
I know.
And now we have you in person.
It's all true.
It's incredible. As Judge Carnwath said this morning, it is actually really nice to see people in person once in a while, but we have to do it very carefully, of course. And then online joining us as well is Dr. Christopher Campbell du Rufflet. I'm going to introduce the other speakers and discussants after, but I think that's a good place for us to just start off. And again, we do want this to be a participatory dialogue. So I'm going to ask speakers to really just give us a few bullet points on what you're writing about, what you're thinking about, and do it in as engaging and provocative a way possible, on the understanding that you will get many more questions that way. Is that fair? It's kind of odd to try to do a roundtable when you have a traditional lecture hall from the 18th century looking at you, but we're going to give it a go. All right. So please, Cosmin.
Yeah, me first. Okay. Thank you very much, Marika. I think I'm audible. It's fine, no worries. No, it's fine. We're gonna discuss, among others, obviously, in the book about NDCs and in particular, the niche of human mobility and climate change, obviously in the context of climate change and disasters. And we'll argue for the mandate which the governments needs to receive from their own policies, like NDCs and adaptation, NAPs and adaptation plans, in order to develop human mobility plans. It's often heard, unfortunately, in these circles at COPs in general, that human mobility is an adaptation tool, where we completely disagree, because we believe that migration, as far as migration could be an adaptation tool, displacement and planned relocation is not at all. So in this regard, we are believing that the governments need a mandate in order to create their own policy. So we are taking the bottom-up approach. We are looking at the NDCs and NAPs which do not mention human mobility. Out of 82 new NDCs which are submitted by September by the parties of this conference, none of them actually included human mobility as a concept. And unfortunately, if you are looking at the numbers of people displaced due to climate change and disaster, this is increasing and even tripling the number of people displaced by conflict. So in this regard, we're going to look at the mandate which the government needs to receive by mentioning, at least, not necessarily analyzing profoundly, but at least mentioning human mobility in the NAPs and NDCs, taking some kind of responsibility in order for them to be able further to develop the policy development, the policies in regards to human mobility on planned relocation guidelines, displacement guidelines, standard operation procedures, like some of the countries already started and are on the way of finalizing them. So this is in a nutshell what we are going to talk about. And yeah, if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Janina, I don't know how to do it. If there's a roving microphone, we could hand it to you. If not, you could step up. Oh, there we are. We're creating a hot seat. This is brilliant. Thank you, Cosmin. We're just going to cycle people in. And Megan, you're close by, so we can just let it grab you as you come.
I would more comfortable over there, but
and then yes,
hello,
you're
everyone.
invited as well to say a few words if you wish in the dialogue.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Magdalena Stria, but I just want to also welcome Professor Agnes Kabuska. She's sitting over there because three of us, we are author of the chapter Legal Aspects of Achieving Just Transition, the case of Poland. And the third author is Professor Tomasz Pietrzykowski, Vice Rector of University in Silesia, but he sends best regards, but he couldn't be with us today. And we decided to write about this because I have a cards, because I'm afraid that I will be stressed and I forget something, so I prefer to use it. I just want to start with the sentence that without a successful transformation in Poland, European climate policy has no chance of success. So to make Poland particular important participant in the transformation process at the discussion on the condition and the course. So we decided to start with just transition to show what the concept of just transition means. And it's like from union trade movement to hard EU law through soft international law. So we will show the just transition involves the implementation of policies aiming to create a fair and prosperous future for workers and communities as the world with a low carbon economy, and that also just transition involves relevant stakeholders, giving them the right to be heard at the stage of planning, implementing, and evaluating the transformation process. We also want to show the situation in Poland and what was happened between 2017 and 2020, that it was the time that Poland barely achieved any reduction in emissions, but we have now 2021, and Polish government presented the energy strategy till 2040. So there is a light in the tunnel and there is a hope. And the Poland is a very problematic area. The Polish climate policy is full of paradoxes. So that's what we already wrote that, and we already sent it to you, our chapters. So we are waiting for your critical opinion. If we have to change it, just tell us, and we'll do it right away. So this is our idea. If I may, I just one more time tell you the title. It's a legal aspect of achieving just transition in the case of Poland.
Wow.
So.
I think we're developing a tradition at this conference of womanals.
Yeah, this is
I think that was Cosman's real strategy. He was like, yeah, I can do this.
I like it.
Yeah, it's kind of cool. So Megan, why don't you just switch places with Magda? And that way they can see you online. And we're going to bring you back into the conversation.
Thank you so much. So my name is Megan Bowman, and I'm an associate professor at King's College London. I'm director of the Climate Law and Governance Centre there. And I want to thank Marie-Claire for this incredibly generous invitation to contribute to this incredible book, because I think we need a book like this, particularly as lawyers and law students and law professors. We need a book like this. So it's really exciting to be able to contribute to this important project. Thank you. So the chapter that I will be contributing will be co-authored with Dr. Emily Webster, who actually was one of our PhD students in the centre and who's now a full lecturer at Cambridge University. So it's incredibly exciting to have this opportunity to author with her and work with her. And we're going to take this topic of courage, contributions and compliance in the context of finance and markets. And where I want to begin with that, our chapter, I'm going to walk you through just a few things, but the chapter itself, I think we want to be dynamic in the face of what's coming up at this COP. As you know, we had Finance Day on day 3, and a lot of announcements were made. And there's a lot of questions about what do those announcements mean? How are they going to land? How will they actually transition into action? And that's where the focus is now. So I want to begin with something that is already in black and white, and it's Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement. And I'm going to exhort you to take that as your North Star, all of us to take it as our North Star from here on. What does it say? It's in the objectives section. And it's gone under the radar, particularly by legal scholars, interestingly enough. Business people have picked up on it more quickly than we have. And what it says is essentially that all finance flows must flow consistently in the direction of a low carbon, climate resilient economy development. And that's in the context of the SDGs and poverty reduction. All finance flows are consistent with the first 2 objectives, Article 2.1a and 2.1b, in relation to the temperature goal of well below 2 degrees, preferably within 1.5, and heightened focus on adaptation in 2.1b. So 2.1c is actually, it's when you look at Article 2.1c that the proverbial penny drops, which is this effort to get Article 2.1a and 2b, those 2 objectives happening, is a huge effort. And it will require not just systems change, not just behavioural change, technological change, but it will require lots and lots of money. So then the question is, well, who pays for that? Where does that money come from? So this is the question. It was square on the agenda for Finance Day, day 3. And essentially, compliance with Article 2.1c is our first C word in this book, which is courage. because it's going to take courage to comply with Article 2.1c, because essentially what it demands is systemic shifts in financial systems. It requires all finance, no longer a differentiation between green finance and everything else. It requires just finance that is sustainable. That is the future. And therefore, by definition, business as usual as currently conceived is history. Now, if we understand that, then we understand the enormity of the challenge in front of us. And we begin to understand, or we ought to, the incredibly important role of law and regulation to this shift. And we can use the word transition. It's a really nice word because it feels very gentle. But I suspect it will actually have to be more of a revolution, given the 8 years or so that we have, according to the IPCC, to make this work. So that's where the courage is required. That's where the compliance is required. The contributions, of course, come from public sector. We know that from the 100 billion promise by 2020, which hasn't been met, but which will need to be, not just because it's a monetary value, but because it's a trust value, a trust issue between developing and developed countries. That's what that is now. So that will need to be met. And then, of course, the second contribution is from private sector market finance, the difference between that 100 billion and the multiple trillions that will be required to actually implement the Paris Agreement and move us to a low carbon climate resilient world. And that will require market finance, that will require private sector actors, and that raises a bunch of normative as well as instrumental, as well as legal and regulatory questions about how best to do this. How do you align self-interested entities with the public interest? So that's really important. And certainly on Finance Day at this COP26, we had a number of announcements around finance, one of which was GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, with its $130 trillion of assets under management becoming aligned with 1.5 degrees, which is an incredibly promising transition, incredibly promising promise, but it needs to be made, it needs to be made concrete. So in addition to this, we're going to need mandatory net zero targets as well as mandatory transition plans. You're going to need both. We're going to need accountability and transparency. And that can happen.
It's the next person waiting online.
Awesome. Okay, I have to get up, which is fantastic. I see Joanna Selt's litigation is going to be important with that. Eyes on 2030, not just 2050. And of course, this money must flow to developing countries. So that's a whole nother conversation. The last thing that I just want to add is a fourth C. I want to add a fourth C, yeah,
Right.
which is creativity.
Oh, good. That was in there originally. Excellent.
It is going to require creativity, and it's going to require it from us, the legal and regulatory experts, because we have such an important role here. If you are talking about markets, and if you're talking about finance, and you're talking about systems change, then you must be talking about law and regulation, because it will not happen on its own. I did hear the head of the Financial Conduct Authority say 2 days ago, we're looking at a market-led transition. I don't think we are. We won't have a transition if it's market. Yeah. So we need this dance between government policy, firm-led leadership, and legal and regulation to make it happen. Thank you.
I think everyone here knows full well, and particularly with Wendy Miles, QC, sitting right there in front of us, that there are a whole set of folk in this conference who agree very passionately with what you're saying. We actually gave you extra time as well, though, because it is really important that some of these issues get brought forward. And she's the director of the Climate Law and Governance Center, right? So who's going to be teaching from this book? Right? so let's just be clear about, extra time is kind of warranted in that instance. So just quickly, in terms of transparency, online is Chris Campbell du Roufflet. And speaking of our PhD students who have then gone on to become the Banting postdoctoral fellow at Cambridge, I think we have a colleague of ours here who has also been working incredibly hard down in the Brew Zone at a project that I set him. I think it was probably my fault, wasn't it? A few years ago when he said, as a Francophone, he wanted to assist with some of the negotiations. And I said, talk to some of the African countries who really need you. Don't just say, you know, oh, I'd like to interview for you for my PhD. Say, and how can I help? So Chris, over to you for somebody who is truly helping.
Thank you so much, Mary Claire, for this great introduction. I am very grateful. It was thanks to this encouragement that I was able to approach the delegation of Burkina Faso and offer to volunteer with them throughout the last couple of COPs. And it really made a difference for my research. It sparked my interest for questions of accountability, implementation, and transparency, which is what we're addressing in this chapter with my co-author, Raul Salas Reyes, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. The assumption that transparency will drive implementation is at the core of many multilateral environmental agreements, and it certainly is at the core of the Paris Agreement. This idea that the sunshine effect, the very act of reporting, independently of what happens with the reports afterwards through technical expert review or multilateral assessments, that will drive implementation. And we can see this assumption really laid out in the wording of Article 13, which says, you know, the framework it needs or is meant to build trust, confidence, and to promote effective implementation. And that's what we want to unpack with Raul, this assumption that reporting will drive implementation. In the case of the Paris Agreement, as you know, some of the two pillars of transparency are states' national inventory reports, as well as biannual transparency reports on mitigation, adaptation, and support actions. So with Raul, in this interesting interdisciplinary perspective, because I'm a legal scholar and he is one of international relations, we approach this assumption that transparency will drive implementation through this observation that scholars have raised, that practitioners have raised in gray literature, that he has observed. He's a member of the independent roster of experts of the UNFCCC, so he's involved in technical expert reviews, that sometimes transparency can have counterproductive or unexpected consequences. For instance, Gupta and Van Asselt warned that sometimes transparency and transparency frameworks can divert resources from the substantive climate action of states and divert those resources towards reporting challenges and improve reporting. In another piece, Hughes, Geist, and Tozer warned that transparency can marginalize the issues that are not the object of reporting. By diverting this attention to some issues, it can marginalize other issues. And in another piece, Siplet and others warned that unintentionally, this movement of going from some issues to others can lead to policies that further entrench inequality. So our attention was sparked by this hypothesis that transparency sometimes can deliver the very opposite of what it pursues. And that's what we'll explore in the chapter. And we take the lens, we ask, well, what's the opposite? What is the opposite of those unintended consequences? And we use the notion of transformative. We ask when transparency can be transformative, and what is transformative transparency? And different authors have approached that through different ways. Weichmann and Gupta suggest that transparency that works is a transparency that enhances accountability, mutual trust, and more ambition actions by parties. For Siplet, a higher threshold should be set. Transformative transparency also disrupts systems and practices of inequality and encourage more just governance, in this case, climate governance at the domestic level. And for Park and Kramar's famous accountability scholars, transparency fosters learning, transformation, and the resolution of disagreements regarding how to tackle global environmental challenges. I won't go through the whole chapter because I want to keep this short, but we focus on three practical challenges. One is the identification of non-greenhouse gas indicators in parties' biennial transparency reports. The second is accounting for climate finance provided. Parties will need to describe their finance contributions in light of the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement and explain how these address developing parties' needs. And third, parties reporting on climate impacts and adaptations. So to conclude, I'll sum up by saying that we observe a constant risk that national reporting have counterproductive effects, but there's also an opportunity under Article 13 to translate efforts to build reporting capacity in ultimately better domestic policies. And that's a call for actions and involvement by researchers from law and political sciences and others to see how we can achieve this. And one hypothesis that emerges from those three case studies that we take is that reporting, that integrating reporting on different issues, for instance, mitigation, adaptation, and sustainable development, offer a promise to encourage policies that are more just at the domestic level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. And thanks especially for keeping it informal and brief. When an academic, the first thing we want to do is start to cite lots of sources and give grand theories. And you managed to sort of bridge between the theory and the actual concrete ideas that are going to be in this chapter. And we're looking forward to the chapter, by the way. So just quickly then, we will travel to a couple of our other colleagues who are here with us in the room and online, especially Tim Arvan and Mrinalini Shinde, who has been helping us throughout. And I have a colleague as well. I can see Vedanta and Tejas there, who have been invited to contribute to the book. And I will let you decide how you wish to intervene today, but we'd love it if you just gave a couple of bullet points about what kind of ideas you're exploring. So first, Mrinalini and Tim, and then Vedanta and Tejas, before we turn to the audience to ask you, especially since many of you are actually also authors, but you're hosting entire sessions on your chapters or plenaries on your chapters. We would like to hear from you how you think that this book can evolve and whether you think that this framework of courage, contributions, and compliance and creativity is one that we can use to be able to get this textbook moving. So first, Mrinalini, Tim, would you like us to ask her first and then you come on up? Okay. Go ahead, Mrinalini, please.
Thanks, Marie-Claire. I'm contributing my chapter along with Professor Alexandra Harrington to the last section of the book on future possibilities for the Paris Agreement. And the focus of this chapter is particularly to see how the Paris Agreement can act as a vehicle and as an example of how international law can be decolonized. So in international law, we see a lot of prominent scholars criticizing it for being a vehicle of empire and for being not accessible to a large part of previously colonized nations. So there are two ways where you can look at decolonization in IL, as Sandeep Ahuja says, that one, that it is always going to be in service to empire, and the other, which I plan on using in the chapter, is that while international law can have problems and its true spirit can be distorted, there are ways in which these vestiges can be removed and broaden the scope of IL to make it truly inclusive and decolonized. And I do genuinely believe that the Paris Agreement has the spaces to do that. And all of the criticism comes from a place of pure love for the Paris Agreement, because I am exactly as old as the UNFCCC. I was born in the same month that the UNFCCC was adopted. So I do love this convention and this agreement. And so it has been quite a journey to identify these spaces for decolonization, such as, for example, historical emissions, whether we are going to move towards a modality of understanding emissions, not just as to the final source, but how the supply chain and how the annual flows of consumption result in the consumption of the carbon budget. So it's not only where countries at source produce emissions, but also how countries who consume those emissions account for them in our understanding of historical emissions and in the supply chain of carbon accounting. So that is a massive space for decolonization. Again, with respect to indigenous communities, now the Paris Agreement is a very unique agreement in how strongly and how clearly it talks about the importance of local communities and indigenous peoples, including the platform, the fact that they are a constituency within the UNFCCC process. However, a major success would be to create distinctions between local communities and indigenous peoples, because the language and institutions of the Paris Agreement require that indigenous peoples are treated specially, and that how they are differently affected by the socio-economic crisis of colonization and climate change, which is very different from the effects of local communities, for example. Loss and damage, another important issue that we will be exploring as a space for decolonization. So especially the current discussion on loss and damage often goes to insurance and risk transfer. And this is a very neoliberal framing of the problem, and it can evade the discussion then on culpability, and it ignores certain types of events that cannot be insured in the insurable risk category. So that those are the spaces for decolonization that we are looking at. There's also some discussion on Article 6, which is a very tenuous discussion, as you can be sure to follow in the news reports from COP. And also we discussed several issues in procedure. So whether there is a potential for parties actually clarifying and voting on rules of procedure on consensus versus voting, and whether if the Paris Agreement would be able to solve these questions of the rules of procedure to ensure that all parties are represented rather than the pursuit of consensus, which sometimes can cause lower ambition. And already by the creation of the High Ambition Coalition, etc., we see that parties are willing to step away and increase their contributions. So I hope that that was a short overview of the chapter, and I'm really looking forward to feedback on how, if you have any spaces that you have identified already, and especially outcomes from COP26 that we should be including in this chapter. Thank you so much.
Thank you as well for all of the hard work that you've done, not just on your own chapter, but also facilitating the chapters of others. Deeply appreciated. I'm going to invite Tim to come straight up, and also just to agree with Marina Lini, on Tuesday, Wednesday, it's all blending. We actually invited Antonio Guterres down to Cambridge, where he arrived in order to receive an honorary degree that, together with the Vice Chancellor and others, I had proposed him for before the pandemic. And it was a Doctor's of Law. And we actually, in his degree ceremony, underscored the call to action and the call to changing the way the UN system and the international legal system works as being part of why we were recognizing and honoring him. A change that is happening worldwide in our universities, not fast enough, but definitely something many of us are pushing, and we will be pushing, including in this book. So I really appreciate the points that you're making, Marina Lini. I think we were all quite taken with a recent book that came out on whether international law is actually international. That was very, very good and telling analysis. And I think that it is through your efforts that we're going to be able to change that. Speaking of changing things, Tim, you have got some really brilliant ideas that you're going to be sharing in this book.
Thank you so much, Marie-Claire, and I'm honored and thrilled to be contributing a chapter with you in the final section of the book on future direction. I'd like to keep my remarks very brief, but as a non-lawyer contributing to this legal handbook, I feel that it's sort of my responsibility to emphasize that even the best legal innovations on climate change can fall short in the implementation phase when subjected to domestic politics and when subjected to institutional politics. And this is particularly true in the context of institutional carbon neutrality goals. In our chapter, in my chapter, which Marie-Claire will help me with, I argue that carbon neutrality is now the dominant policy paradigm for institutions taking climate action now. And I set forth sort of three mechanisms by which institutions can increase their courage in the way they conceptualize these plans. At the moment, there is really no systematic integration of pursuit of sustainable development goals in approaches for institutional carbon neutrality. And we propose that institutions can leverage the non-local emissions reductions inherent to net zero to better, one, achieve cost-effective emissions reduction by relaxing the financial constraints on institutions while maintaining the highest standard of carbon accounting. Two, as Dr. Bottigliero so eloquently said earlier, we need to prioritize the communities and the vulnerable populations in pursuit of carbon neutrality. And this means targeting knowledge spillovers to marginalized communities in strategic ways. And we look specifically at regional approaches in the United States for renewable power generation with Navajo Nation in the West. Finally, also on this note of targeting, we find that economic benefits and air quality benefits can be spatially targeted. And these really must be prioritized in the way that institutions think about co-benefits of the SDGs in emissions reduction. And so I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. And I look forward to receiving feedback from the panel.
So incredibly. Tim in his spare time serves as research officer for the whole CISDL, and he can still come up with incredible work like that, which is, it's an honor to actually be co-authoring with you rather than the other way around. One of the things I really love as well, of course, with when I get to write things with Tim, is that the CISDL has a policy that whoever does the most work on a chapter, their name goes first. And I have to continually get dragged in to conversations with, shall we say, world-leading academic publishers who don't understand that. And with Tim, it's actually okay because Arban, right? So alphabetically, I can already push things over to him. So we have a couple of other colleagues in the room who are welcome to intervene from the floor or coming up here. And then we have actually quite a few of you as well who are writing or might have questions or ideas. So what we'd like to do is open the floor for at least a little bit of participation, understanding that we are on a very, very strict time limit because we do have to meet back in that hall at exactly 15:45 in order to deal with the joys of a COP26, which, like any COP, has its wildcards. We're going to be doing our closing session in a beautiful gallery with glasses of wine in our hand because they understand that they need to do a security sweep for someone I'm not allowed to mention who will be visiting, and they're worried that, if we're still here, they won't be able to check every nook and cranny that is necessary for that person. So what I would like to be able to do, if we can, is just open it up. If you'd like to put up your hand, and that would include Tejas and Vedanta and others who have been invited to write chapters. And then at a certain moment, we will turn to the co-editors and also Professor Rosa Fernandez Egea, who was our host last year in Madrid, given 5 weeks to organize before we moved from Santiago to Madrid, the COP. So we've not our first rodeo, folk. We've dealt with some pretty interesting situations before here at Climate Governance Day. And Rosa has agreed to close the session for us. So what we will do is just ask, are there any questions? Are there any comments? If not, poor Tejas is going to have to speak. So, save his life. Excellent. All right. So we have Joe, and then we have Vedanta, and then we have Tejas, who is willing to step in. Thank you. Joe, would you like to go first?
Yeah, so I just had a quick question. Recording in progress. Dr. Bowman, and it's just about conversation about
Sorry, Joe.
Yeah, so how can you move the legislative force in this revolution and a legal system that sometimes resists change?
So I'm down here, but do you want to take some questions and then we'll go all at once?
Yeah, we will. And I should also, the student who's just spoken deserves some special recognition because during the pandemic, there were quite a few students who for quite a few weeks were unable to access education, as you know, the lockdown. And together with many others from his college and also around the world, including from Indigenous open learning high schools in Canada, they put together a series of tutorials online, and they dragged in all of us professors to help out in order to keep things going. And it was probably one of the most inspiring things I've ever been part of. So Joe, kudos to you and to Winchester College and to everybody who helped with that. A place of knowledge. So we're going to come over to Vedanta and then to Tejas as well.
Surely. I don't know if the question wants to be answered first. It's more of a
intervention rather than a question.
Perfect, even better.
Yeah, just to speak. Okay. So I was going to speak more from my time as a climate diplomat in the UK government, which I wasn't until recently, working on the COP26 summit and some stuff before that, and a bit about where some of the thinking was, which might be interesting for this conversation. And I guess there were two key starting points, maybe for this. One was that we've had international summits, well, for the last 20 years or so or more. And emissions have doubled in that time. The summits obviously intended to reduce emissions. And the other is that the IEA's analysis just yesterday said that commitments at COP might limit reduction emissions global warming to 1.8 degrees. If you take NDCs, it's much higher. That's interesting. And I'll come back to that in a second. The question of what happens after COP26, and this is the UK's thinking, as it goes points to some direction into the organising entities that we have around climate diplomacy. For a long time, we've had focused just on NDCs, really, so climate diplomats. And that's a bit of a zero-sum game. Everyone's fighting over their slice of the emissions cake. And instead, we wonder, do we need to have more focus on coordination? And coordination is differentiated from cooperation. Cooperation where a country says, I'm doing this, another country says, I'm doing this. We say, oh, great, let's learn from each other. Coordinations where we do things together at the same time, same direction. For example, we phase out cars at the same day. If we do that, we accelerate battery adoption, we accelerate the production of cars, we bring down costs together, we all win. The movement from a zero-sum game to a positive-sum game. And just say, like, at COP26, we see so many initiatives being launched for that reason. That's a big thing in the government. So, one's on steel, one's on cars, initiatives on power, new entities as well as commitments. And I think the question that then becomes really interesting, if that shift is happening, is one, how do you make sure they're organized to be effective? So, which ministries are involved? How big do you make them? How do you balance inclusivity versus the market size of the big countries who will change that? And the second thing that's really interesting is how do you keep all of these commitments? How do you make sure they're not just there and actually reinforce them through education, through advocacy, through other mechanisms? How do you make sure that they have to? That's the only thing, yeah, that's the insight.
Which is an incredible contribution and super, super important. And actually, in a funny way, Marina Leading's coming at it from the academic side after spending years in the UNFCCC Secretariat. Sorry for outing you, Marina Leading. And you're coming at it from the bottom of how do we actually help the lawyers all over the world, but especially in the South, become not just leaders in this debate, but actually the leaders in this debate, as they should be as the majority world. Thank you. And Tejas, you had a couple of comments, and then we also have a colleague in the corner who has thrown his hat into the ring, and then we'll come back over to close on time.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just going to say 4 sentences so that I don't take too much time from anyone. The chapter that I'm co-authoring is titled Emerging Research Agenda for Climate Law and Governance Innovation. So I'm here doing field research at COP26 and doing field research at Climate Law and Governance Day. And we're grounding it essentially, the chapter is being grounded in the common timeframes that have been agreed on for the global stocktake, for example, in 2023, as well as other commitments that have been made by states for 2030, 2050, and 2100. And I'm curious to learn from all of you, as well as at COP26, what you think the climate law and governance research agenda should be as a result of the 2023 stocktake or during the 2023 stocktake, and where you think it should go next, because that's what we're going to base that chapter on. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts and hear from all of you. Thank you.
Excellent. And one last comment, and then I'm going to turn over, if Rosa, you want to come up and slip into the hot seat, I'm going to turn over to my co-chairs and also to Rosa to close.
Thank you. From Uppsala University. It's lovely to hear about both different chapters. I think I'm a bit curious on how you define the scope for this handbook when you talk about climate law and governance, how you sort of frame governance. Legislation or law is part of governance, for a number of other political ties. And I mean, the scoping of this nice conference is speaking for itself in a way, but I'm curious how you think when you set up the frames for this publication.
Excellent. So taking full advantage of my position as one of the chairs of the panel, but also the conference, I'm going to turn to my co-editors to answer these excellent questions. And Megan's willing to also jump in with Joe, either now or Joe, if you find her right afterward. You know, really cool place to do further studies. Okay, so Alexandra, Christina.
Well, I'm happy to try to answer your question. It's a very important one, and it's not the one that's easy to answer, because when you work with climate change, law, governance, science, even, you realize it's a multi-level, pluri-central issue. It's very hard to pinpoint onto one level, one issue, because everything we do actually on all levels somehow has an impact. And I think this is reflected in the book as well. It has a broad scope. It looks at the international level, it looks at the national level, it even has a community aspect, and it is broad also in its different sectorial approaches. And I think it has to be. You cannot limit it without also being not credible enough. But of course, it's a challenge. There's always something that may have to be added that falls outside. You may have some overlap, some gaps, but I think that's what we're facing when we're dealing with something as complex, as challenging as climate change.
And filling a gap that has to be filled. There's no possibility of not getting this textbook out. Please, Alexandra.
No, I think just to kind of piggyback up that, it is the challenge of talking about governance in general. Whether we're talking about it in climate change, whether we're talking about it in any other arena, the challenge of talking about governance is making sure that we don't have gaps, or if we do have gaps, we at least identify them, and then we figure out how we might address them in the future. And by bringing them up and by talking about them, that we then create the next generation that will be discussing them. So I think that really is something that we do keep in mind as we move throughout this publication and many others as well.
And that is a well-qualified answer. She was our chair of global governance with a Fulbright for the last 3 years, writing a book on exactly these issues. So I think we have Tim and others well represented in the governance side of this particular debate. Rose, I'm going to turn to you for a few words to close. We have this really weird mic that you can't basically move, but if you want to lean forward and squidge over, and that way, because also that way Tim can be joining us, and Tejas and Vedanta, if you can come up and join us as well, just because they are taking a few pictures of the panel, and you're actually authors, and we wanted you to be part of it. So if you don't mind, the folk along the back row are secretly taking pictures. That would be really appreciated. Rosa.
Okay, thank you, Marie-Claire. You can hear me well.
Too, Megan. And Cosmin and Magda.
I'm going to be very, very brief, not 1 minute. It's going to take my final remarks. I just want to thank you for your extremely interesting and inspiring contributions and presentations for this book. There's such good examples of this courage, contribution, and compliance, which is needed to fight and to adapt to climate change and its effects, which are terrible. And I think it's precisely this the role of the academics. This is precisely the role of academics and law practitioners supposed to be researching this global problem with unprecedented challenges and provide. And here's where provide some ideas, and here's where the element with on creativity that was suggested comes, for transforming the world that we are living in into a more sustainable and just one, not only for current generations, but also for future generations. So I'm convinced that this book will constitute a very relevant contribution in achieving this goal. So congratulations to the editors and to all authors for this engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And that would be our cue to get over to the plenary because we have some incredible panels coming up.
magically kept up to time.
Okay.